Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I'm your host, Rex Bear, and tonight's guest is Richard B. Spence, a professor at the University of Idaho and specializing in Russian intelligence and military history. His course offers modern espionage, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust, history of secret societies, and the occult in history. Now, he is author of several books. The main focus tonight will be Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. The information Richard brings to the table is quite compelling, especially when you learn about how the occult and intelligence agencies work hand in hand. Make sure to go to leakproject.com. If you become a contributing member at Leak Project, you'll have access to exclusive content, ad-free. You can either download the shows or listen to them live streaming on the website. Also, you can go to youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord. Subscribe on YouTube, get access to the latest podcasts, absolutely free. Hope you're doing well wherever you are. Enjoy the show. And remember, be the change you want to see. This is Rex Bear. Talk to you soon.
Hello.
Hello, Richard.
This is me.
Hey, Rex Bear. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Oh, fantastic. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
I'm glad to talk to you.
Now, I'm on the website. It looks like it's the University of Idaho website. Do you have a specific website that I can promote?
No, I don't. I think that's the only one.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm a Luddite when it comes to that, I guess.
Okay.
All right.
Now, do you have a specific book, or is it just a course about the modern espionage and the stuff that you've put together with your Russian intelligence work, etc.?
Well, I've got the two main books I probably have are the one you may be the most interested in is Secret Agent 666, which deals with Aleister Crowley and British intelligence and the occult.
Okay.
I also have written a book called Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley. I'm not sure if his name certainly isn't as well known as Aleister Crowley's is, but Sidney Riley was nominally, and I emphasize the nominal part, was a British intelligence operative in the early 20th century, which you usually find combined with the words a prototype or model for James Bond. He wasn't, but that's another story in and of itself. I also wrote, my first book was back in the 1990s, was a biography of another, even more obscure fellow by the name of Boris Savinkov. It's called Renegade on the Left. And there's a little tale there. Savinkov is certainly not as well known a name in the Russian Revolution as, say, Trotsky or Lenin or Kerensky. But I'd argue that he, in his own way, was every bit as important. He's one of those people that I'd say became inconvenient to the later historical narrative and therefore was largely edited out of it. Most recently, a book I co-authored with Walter Bosley is one called Empire of the Wheel. And that was kind of a departure for me because it has to do with a set of seemingly unrelated, but as it turns out, not totally unrelated murders around San Bernardino, California, back during about 1915 and 1916. And what we did there was to try to piece together who was involved and different accounts of the cases, and it leads some rather curious directions. The book I'm working on now, if I can put in a plug for that,
Absolutely,
is a book called Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. Now, if that sounds familiar to some people, that's because there's a reasonably well-known book by Anthony Sutton. It was published back in the 1970s called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. So what I want to add here is that I'm not doing this book to either rip off Anthony Sutton or to fundamentally disagree with him. One of the things his book did was to really sort of inspire me in certain ways. And I think with the materials that he had available to him, say in 1972 or 1974, he did an astounding job. There's a lot more stuff that's available. There's a lot of things that can be fleshed out. There are a few little things that could be changed or tweaked. But that's why, at least my tentative title for this book is Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, because I'm taking a kind of broader look, going all the way back to, say, 1905, the abortive revolution then, and then really sort of all the way up into the mid-20s, about a 20-year period. And that is proving quite a bit of work, and I'm sort of in the throes of trying to cobble together the various things that I've assembled for that now. But that's the main thing I'm working on at present.
When you wrote the Secret Agent 666 in regards to Aleister Crowley, I mean, this is a very infamous person that used to claim to be the most wicked man in the world, and I think that he kind of did that a lot of times just to cause ooh and ah with the masses. I've read several of his books, and actually one that really had a pretty powerful impact was the book that he wrote called Four, which is actually 4 books compiled together. And he supposedly did automatic writing with these deities. And if you've read any of that work, like the Book of the Law, the Book of Thoth, etc., I mean, just a very mystical person, and certainly liked to write in codes and riddles. I've heard that he was a British spy before, and if you even look at today's society, he has had a huge impact on Hollywood, the entertainment industry, etc. So let's get into that. What can you tell us about the infamous Aleister Crowley, the Beast?
Well, Aleister Crowley, the great beast 666, the wickedest man in the world, the arch Satanist or arch occultist of the 20th century, I think you hit upon one very important thing. A good deal of his reputation is hype. And part of that is hype of other people's creation, and part of it is hype of his own creation. But I have to add a kind of disclaimer anytime that I'm asked to talk about him. And the important disclaimer is to make it very clear up front that I am not a Crowleyite or a Thelemite. That is, I do not subscribe to his beliefs. I am not a member of any of his organizations. I don't belong to the OTO, etc. That being said, I have nothing against people who do. I'd say that of those people who are Crowley followers that I've encountered, all of them have proven to be very normal, helpful, rational people. I don't know what they do in private, but I mean, I've never had any negative encounters with them. So I sort of approach him from the standpoint of an interested party and agnostic, and that's sort of the way that I approached him. And one of the things that I'd emphasize is that there are a number of very good biographies of Aleister Crowley out there. And if you want to get the whole gist of the man, you really should read more things besides my book, because my book tends to concentrate, you get an overview of his life, but it does really concentrate on that one, I think, both overlooked and or readily dismissed and controversial area of his work for intelligence. Now, that's one of those things that might strike some people as seemingly, fantastic, because why on earth would any intelligence agency, none less than the British, who are supposed to be fairly good at that sort of thing historically, why on earth would they employ as an agent a man of such a negative and notorious reputation? Now, that reputation, if you noticed, is still very much alive today. In fact, I'd say maybe one of the most tragic things about Aleister Crowley is that he never lived long enough to sort of finally reap the rewards of his fame. He was a man who, in economic terms, was never successful during his lifetime. He became an undischarged bankrupt in the mid-1930s and remained one up until his death in 1947, which raises a little interesting question as to how he supported himself, but maybe we'll get to that. But today, I mean, if he still managed to own the copyrights to any of the works he'd done, he would be restored to the position of a wealthy man, which is pretty much the way he began his life. So what got me started? I'm going to go back there. I mean, why would I pick up this topic at all? I was back at the end of the 1990s, just around 2000. I was in the throes of finishing up the book on Riley, the Trust No One book. And one of the centers of action in that book is New York during the First World War, because Riley was there as a purchasing agent for the Russian government, among other things. And one of the things I was doing, one of the things I always do with this stuff is that, when you encounter the person you're interested in, you have to pay very close attention to the people that they meet and come in contact with and do business with or sleep with or whatever. And my basic suggestion, maybe an obvious one to any researchers out there, is never ignore a lead. I mean, even if it's a seemingly casual acquaintance, the fact that people meet, you should look into it. I mean, true, 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100, that lead will go nowhere. It may just be that. It may just be a casual acquaintance of some kind. But you can't let that go without a certain degree of investigation, because one person can lead you to another, that individual that seems to be a casual acquaintance could prove to be a critical link between the figure you're interested in and someone else. So what I was interested in is that I knew that Crowley was also active in New York at the same time that Riley was. And I knew that Crowley had claimed at various points after the First World War that he had worked for the British government or British intelligence during that time. And might add that one of the reasons why he would often go out his way to claim that was to refute the charge that he was a traitor. And the reason why people would dub him a traitor was because he did, in fact, in the period between late 1914 when he arrived and 1919 when he left during the war, one of the things he did was that he wrote anti-British propaganda for a pro-German publication. In fact, it was a magazine called The Fatherland, and I don't know what better name you could give to a pro-German publication. But he wrote for the Fatherland. He knew exactly what the Fatherland was. He knew that the editor of the Fatherland, a guy by the name of George Sylvester Viereck, was a German propaganda agent. And the stuff that Crowley wrote is, it's not accidentally anti-British. It's deliberately and scurrilously anti-British. So that too seems to, create an apparent absurdity to say that a man who was employed in the war writing propaganda for the enemy against his own country couldn't possibly have served the interests of that country, and must have been, as he was later described, a traitor. And therefore, all of his subsequent claims that what I was doing, I was really doing for the British government, and it wasn't what it was appeared, were just his attempt to try to defend his despicable reputation. Now, so what I did.
Can I jump in
Go
real
ahead.
quick? Do you
Sure.
feel that he was a double agent then? You're probably going there, but that's just what's coming through my mind right now.
It's one of those things I wouldn't dismiss, but no, my take at looking through it is that he wasn't a double agent. He was, let's put it this way, he was a British mole inside the German propaganda and to some degree sabotage apparatus in the US. That's what his job was. The interesting question is to how he got them to accept him, knowing that he was indeed British. So, not knowing what much to think about that, and I sort of doubted he was. I figured that was just some other sort of claim that someone came up with. So I set off one of the problems that anybody has doing research in the field of historical intelligence is the sad fact that most historical records, even going back to the beginning of the 20th century or before, are off limits. That is, intelligence agencies don't see themselves generally as archiving agencies, and maybe the simplest thing to keep in mind is that these agencies are involved in collecting secret information in secretive ways. That is, they are secretive agencies, and therefore they sort of expect them to engage in the necessary secrecy of intelligence, which is the whole point of collecting information other people don't want you to have, and keeping information you don't want other people to have out of their hands, to then be sort of forthcoming with their operational histories. That just doesn't really happen. But every now and then, it turns out that there's an agency of this kind that goes defunct. And one of those was an American agency that was very important in World War I, no longer really exists today in that form, which was then called the Military Intelligence Division. So what happened was when the U.S. entered the war in 1917, it really, as incredible as this may sound, did not have any real national intelligence agency, nor even internal security agency. The FBI, as it existed later, did not exist at the time, except in a very limited form. There was no CIA, there was no NSA. And so it sort of fell to the U.S. Army to develop a military intelligence apparatus. The Navy had one too, the Office of Naval Intelligence. But the MID really became the chief, it really functioned much in the way in which the FBI would function today. And internal security and the hunting against spies and saboteurs was one of the main things it was focused on. So not too surprisingly, remember, Aleister Crowley had been in the U.S. since late 1914, and in the period up until the U.S. entry of the war, he had written pro-German propaganda, and of course that became kind of a problem when in April 1917, the United States joined the war against Germany. And as you might expect, there were people within the MID and, even within the New York State Police and Attorney General's office who began to look a little askance at this Englishman not serving his country, hanging out in New York with disreputable people, and who very recently had been working for what was now the enemy. So they began looking into him. And in fact, they not only began looking into him, they even contemplated the idea of arresting him or interrogating him. So they made inquiries. And of course, one of the things that they would do, one of the things that you or I would do, is that they would inquire to the British consulate in New York, what do you know about this guy? So I sent off to Washington, to the National Archives, that holds all the surviving records of the Military Intelligence Division. And I sent off a letter with an inquiry which said, do the records of the MID contain any files pertaining to Aleister Crowley? Sure enough, it did. Not a very big file. In fact, I don't think it's only about 25 pages long. And most of it isn't terribly important, but, as often is the case, on one page, one document in that file contained this. It is a report from 1918 from the head of the MID in West Point, New York, that is up in the Hudson Valley, where Crowley had been active at that time, and this fellow had become interested in him. And so there was an inquiry that was made to the British consulate, and this is essentially what was the information they got. And I'm reading directly from the report on Aleister Crowley, English subject. And it says he had been formally investigated by the Department of Justice on charges of being a German spy. It was determined that Aleister Crowley was an employee of the British government, but at present in this country on official business of which the British consul, New York City, has full cognizance. It was found that the British government was fully aware of the fact that Crowley was connected with the German propaganda and had received money for writing anti-British articles. Now, the reason why that was important is that basically confirms what Crowley later claimed. So when later on he was saying that, yes, I wrote this stuff, but it was all, it was basically designed to win the confidence of the Germans so that I could take advantage of that confidence, and I was really a loyal Englishman doing his bit in his own peculiar way. Well, in that case, he was telling the truth. So that got me interested, and I used that file to write a short article, which, the title of that was also Secret Agent 666. And that article was published in a small journal, I think that the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, which if no one has ever heard of, that's because, like most academic journals, no one has ever heard of them. But one of the things that happened is that thanks to the internet, that article, thanks to the internet, and also, of course, the sort of global interest that the name Aleister Crowley creates, that article was spread around from one place to another, which, by the way, I didn't mind because, just to let your listeners know, professors don't get paid for writing academic articles. We generally don't get paid for writing academic books either. But
Okay.
so, no, you don't get paid.
Well, that
Sometimes they
sucks.
actually expect you to pay. Well, that's the way that's the research we're supposed to do. That's how we keep our jobs.
Gotcha. Okay.
But one of the things that's always kind of despairing about that in a way, I actually had someone, and another historian, who said, well, if you really want to sort of hide historical information, what you do is you publish it in an academic journal, which is pretty much the equivalent of digging a hole, throwing it in, and burying it. And that's a bit of an exaggeration. But the point is, not many people access those, and not many people read them. And this is, in fact, one of my whole complaints about the way in which a lot of historical research, the way historians sort of relate to the outside world, is that we're all too often sort of writing for each other instead, I think, of trying to make the information that we have more broadly available. So that sort of, that article achieved a life of its own, and I started getting feedback. I started getting emails and even actual letters from people saying, well, this is interesting. Maybe you should look more into this. Maybe you should look more into that. And I began getting several people, actually, from different angles. Some of them sort of fans of Crowley, some of them not, saying, you really ought to expand that. You really ought to maybe see if you could make a book out of it. Maybe there's a bigger story there. And at first, I really wasn't certain. Thought I would give it a try. In fact, one of the reasons I was a little reluctant to do that is I had this other book project all set to go, and, generally you don't want to get distracted by something else, but that's what happened. And as I began to dig deeper and collect more information, more and more of this picture emerged. One of the things that became pretty clear is that Crowley's connection to British intelligence wasn't just during the First World War, but which predated it and which followed it. And what it made me do was that it made me take a kind of critical look, at places he visited and at people that he knew. And if you simply look through a lot of the people he knew, some of his closer associates, you're tripping over a spy every time you turn around. It became pretty clear that he had a continual personal relations, or let's say a lifelong personal relationship with people who had themselves had some connection to British intelligence. So that much was there. So the point was, I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't making it up. These things were there. And it really hadn't been, I think, noticed because no one was looking for it. And I think it's one of those things that writing that book really made very plain to me. It was something that I think I understood before, but I'd never realized how much that in going into researching a topic or looking at any kind of historical figure, one of the things that we usually do is that we go into it with, some kind of preconceptions. We already have an idea as to who this person is. And that can be, you have to have some kind of awareness about the person. But the tricky part is not to be completely taken in or overly influenced by other views. That can be the difficult part of trying to take a really fresh view. That is, acknowledging what other people have said or believe about this individual. In the case of Aleister Crowley, it basically went one way or the other. The predominant view was that, again, he was a wicked, despicable man. He was evil. On the other, a sort of minority, but nonetheless strongly felt view was that he was a misunderstood prophet, that he was unjustly vilified, that in fact he was one of the great religious leaders of the modern era. Yeah, so there's a big gap between those two things. So I was aware of both of those points of view, but one of the things that I wanted to do in my approach was not to take either of them literally. And simply to take, well, for instance, like the excerpt I just read from this document, to take that document and what it revealed and just interpret things in that light. Go where the often far too few facts lead you, instead of constantly trying to go with the interpretation first and fit the facts to them. I don't know how much sense that makes, but it's one of the things that can happen. So it's this difficulty sometimes in trying to maintain this balance between, a prior knowledge of the subject and then the ability to look at them objectively. So one of the things I did, certainly what I tried to do, I think I succeeded in doing, was taking a fresh and objective look at one of these people, certainly someone who has been notorious within the 20th century. So what did I see when I looked at that? Well, I saw a man who on again and off again had either volunteered or had been recruited as an intelligence operative or as an agent. And I got to clarify that. When I'm talking about Crowley being a British intelligence agent, I mean just that he was an asset that was employed. He wasn't an officer. He was not engaged. He wasn't a paid employee or career employee of any agency. He was someone that agency, or rather which those agencies, because British intelligence is a house of many rooms, it isn't just one body, but he was utilized because he was, well, for any other reason, an agent is utilized. They're useful. They are exploited. Okay? Remember, you don't recruit agents because you like them necessarily. Also, interestingly enough, you don't recruit intelligence assets because you necessarily trust them. In fact, as strange as it may be, in some cases, the fact that you can't trust them may be one of the things that makes you want to use them. It's the idea of someone being reliably unreliable. If the one thing that you can count on in this person is that you can't really count on them, there are still ways that they can be utilized. So the question would then come up, what would an intelligence agency be able to utilize in a man who seemed to devote himself to occult practices, to membership in strange, secretive, esoteric organizations, who mixed with some rather unusual people, who in some ways might seem to be very untrustworthy? Well, one of the things I realized that did is that it connected him, Crowley's association with what we roughly call the occult, which practically means a variety of small, highly selective, secret esoteric organizations, both in Britain and America. And everywhere he went, he always touched bases with those people, because this is a kind of invisible world. It's a world which really only clearly exists to the initiated. But it is a world. Think of it this way. It's a kind of international subculture. And as all subcultures do, they maintain communication between themselves. And it's not an insignificant subculture. So something else that became pretty apparent is that if you think that, all occultists or members of esoteric organizations are a pack of dysfunctional weirdos, which isn't to say that they may not include dysfunctional weirdos.
It's kind of the opposite, isn't it? Usually, they're more educated.
Well, not only are they more educated, they're often people in positions of great power and influence.
Right.
So one of the things you find, it's not at all odd to find that there are people who are interested in occultism who are involved in intelligence. There almost seems to be a symbiotic relationship between intelligence and occultism. And I think that's probably because that the two things tend to attract similar personality types. Now, again, this isn't to say that everybody who's involved in intelligence is an occultist and all occultists are connected to intelligence. That's not it at all. It simply means that beyond sort of random chance, you're going to find more of a crossover between those two than you would in, let's say, between occultism and, I don't know, farming. Okay, you're not going to necessarily,
Nice.
like I said, every now and then you're going to
Grow,
find
grow.
a farmer occultist. Yes, we'll sacrifice for the crops, but yeah, that's probably there, but it's not something you're going to find a significant correlation. The correlation between intelligence and occultism is well beyond the average.
I just want to
So one of the
validate your point real quick
yeah,
because I have a friend that used to be in the FBI, worked for the Department of Defense. He's been in Langley in the Pentagon. Many of his family members are high up in the military. And he went to college. He's, I think, in his mid 50s right now. He went to many college courses that talked about mysticism, the occult, and even the definition occult. That just means unknown. It's just a form of science, mental applications. There's a lot of different types of mysticism and magic. And I think Crowley, as genius as he was in many ways, and he obviously had his issues as well, but I think he actually was able to use many of those mystical practices and he turned it into a science. Like he could say, okay, I'm going to use this and that and create that, essentially. X and Y equals Z, whatever.
well, I think there's a I wish I could remember to paraphrase it, but there's a I think fairly well-known statement from him, which he's saying in essence that occultism is a science in some way. That the root of what he's after is really a kind of scientific approach. I Something which occurred to me in writing the book, um, and it's one of those things I still don't know how far to take. It was the sort of realization or thought that would come across is that maybe this guy is sort of faking the whole thing. I mean, maybe this whole occultism thing, the magic, the rituals, the ceremonies, the incantations, the robes, the secret signs, that all of this is, not to put a fine point on it, a kind of distracting mumbo jumbo. In other words, that's what people are going to pay attention to, and what is actually in many cases a cover for something else. I mean, it comes back to this question as to why would someone of so flamboyant and notorious a reputation be useful as an intelligence asset? And one of the ways that someone else actually explained this to me, who I think has some idea to know what they were talking about, is they go, look, the very argument, if you can make the argument that this person could not possibly be a spy, they could not be, simply, Aleister Crowley couldn't be, he's simply too notorious. Well, you've actually just created the best basis for him to be so. Because the one thing generally any good intelligence asset or spy, or however you want to describe them, doesn't want to be is to be recognized as such. The whole point is that is not supposed to be you don't walk around with spy written across. So someone who many people would immediately reject the possibility that they could be one, well, that's actually about the best recommendation for the job that you could find. So Crowley, I think, did, to a degree, hide behind his own infamy. That is, and that behind this infamous exterior, there was someone who was, quite thoughtful, quite crafty. One of the things that he was very good at was hypnotism. And well, that was even something else that was once offered to me as an explanation for him was that, well, the guy is basically a hypnotist. That even magic, in this sense, that occult or magical rituals are essentially mass hypnotism. It's people who are inducing themselves, either induced from the outside or self-hypnotism into a hypnotic state. It's maybe too simple of an explanation, and I don't argue that your listeners would have to accept that, but it's a thing to consider that the hypnotic aspect is there, and that's something that Crowley seemed to take a very strong interest in. And it's not, again, as simple to say that he simply went around hypnotizing everybody he met, but he did some. And I think that one of the things that gave him was a very deep perception of how people could be manipulated in their perceptions that it's one of the little tricks that he supposedly liked to pull was to go into public places and essentially become invisible. In fact, there are various points where he talks about becoming invisible. In some cases, he's talking about this as if he's actually trying to become physically invisible.
Did
In
you know
other,
that that's a ritual actually that's performed in
yep,
certain OTO circles where they don't actually go invisible, but they change their vibrational frequencies, the way that they're thinking so slow that it almost makes them invisible because people don't notice them.
that's
It's
it. Yeah,
interesting.
right. It's the way of not becoming transparent, but of either inducing a state in yourself or inducing possibly a hypnotic state in other people around you that they don't notice you, that you become sort of a non-entity. You literally become this kind of fly on the wall, and that's something he seemed to like to play around with. And if you want to believe him on that, was at least occasionally successful with. And then you'd have to come back to this question: well, I don't know, what good would that do anybody in intelligence work? Well, think about it for a minute. If you could either again induce in yourself or in the people around you the the notion that you weren't there. If they lost conscious awareness of you, maybe that's the best way to put it, that in some way you create a situation in which the people around you lose conscious awareness that you were there, well, then you're sitting there listening to what they say, observing what it is that they're doing, and they don't even realize any longer that you're there. I mean, what more could any sort of decent spy ask for? And that actually touches upon this, the other point about this, I think brings us back to this connection, the overlap between intelligence work and occultism, and why an occultist would make a useful agent. One, it gave them connection to this kind of secret world and the people, again, of influence and power who were within it, but also the techniques, this technique of making other people conscious or unaware of you. But it also, almost everything that if you think about it, connected with what would, let's say, magic. All right. That, I mean, imagine just for a moment that it works. All right. That you could either hypnotically or through spells or accessing, I don't know, Great Cthulhu, whatever it is that you want to make a deal with, that you actually can. Remember, I think Crowley, again, one of his quotes argued that magic, and here again I'm going to paraphrase, is the art, yes, the art and science of essentially changing the physical world through will. In other words, it's sort of mind over matter, that through the kind of focused will, or another way to think of it, through concentrated consciousness, that one can affect the world and people around you. Now imagine what you could do with that kind of power if it existed and if you could master it and amplify it. That again has tremendous applications. It not only has applications as a means for gathering or protecting intelligence, the other thing it has an application for is weaponization. Um, the power, if you think of it, the powers of a mage, the powers of an occult master are also things that could be weaponized to some degree. So, not to argue that any of these things exist, but there's the possibility that they might exist. Now, first, it's one of the things that has received a certain amount of press in recent times is that the CIA, the U.S. Army, for instance, sort of reluctantly admit that, yeah, we carried on experiments in ESP and in remote viewing. We played around with these things, though generally insist that nothing really came out of it. We didn't find that it worked or it wasn't reliable, and that may well be true. On the other hand, let's suppose you tried one of these things and you found out it really did work. Well, you're never going to publicly admit that. That's the whole idea. You're conducting a secret program to find out, let's say, I don't know, can we project people's consciousness to other places, remote viewing? Can we project consciousness and actually see and manipulate items there? Well, if you could do that, it would then be the most important thing to do was to make everybody believe that you didn't. So this is the sort of uncertainty principle. I mean, these things were investigated. Maybe they were found to be bunk and useless, and maybe they were found to be exactly the opposite of that. But in either one of those cases, you must get the same answer. No, it didn't work, and we have nothing to do with it. Crowley, I suspect, okay, and saying I suspect is not something you can prove or probably will ever be able to prove, but I suspect from what I have seen And what I've read and what I put together is that he was a kind of pioneer in that area. And I think that's one of the ways that he contributed to the British intelligence of his day, and he may have created a sort of body of work of legacy that lives on even to this day. I mean, he may have been the first person to actually sort of start agencies of that kind, thinking that, well, maybe there's something here that we can use. Because you have to consider for a moment that, if, let's just say, if magic it does work, even if there's a possibility that something in this stuff works, then you better check it out. I mean, you never know. I mean, this is something that people have maintained, exists, and believed in, and a great deal of time and effort has been put into occult practices for centuries. So either it's a long-standing con, or maybe there's something to it. Regardless, that would need to be explored. And then what other things might you come up with while you're exploring that? So when you really begin to think about it in those terms, Aleister Crowley had, if not absolutely unique, he nevertheless had very specialized abilities that would make him useful to any agency within certain limitations. And one of those limitations was that you didn't really want to publicly acknowledge him. But another thing, again, spy agencies are in the practice of publicly acknowledging the people who work for them. And in fact, that's the absolute last thing that you ever want to do. What any good agent is supposed to do is to never talk about what they did, and in return, there's a quid pro quo in this. You keep your mouth shut about what you did, and the agency that employed you will keep its mouth shut that you did it. That is the kind of agreement which is there. And that's one of the things that, as I looked later at Crowley's sort of periodic protestations, but no, I actually was serving the British government, that one of the criticisms of that is that, well, he made this claim, but he never presented any evidence to substantiate it. Okay, he would say, yes, I wrote for, I wrote for the Germans, but I really did it at the behest of the British government. Well, they said, well, he doesn't prove it, therefore he's just lying. He's just making these things up. The retort to that is there wasn't any way he could prove it. That wasn't going to be possible, because for him to prove it would mean that other British intelligence officials, important people, would have to come out and acknowledge that this man had been our agent. Well, that creates a lot of problems. I mean, generally, most governments are reluctant to admit that they spy at all. They all do, but, gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail, as the saying goes. So you would have to admit that, one, you actually do have a spy agency, and that not only that these agencies actually have in their employ people such as Mr. Aleister Crowley, which the public has basically been told is a worshiper of the devil and probably a traitor. Imagine the complications that would come up with that. You would then have to explain, and remember, one of the things that any spy agency doesn't want to do is to explain, to reveal anything. This was one of those things. The whole relationship this is built upon secrecy. What the agent does is secret. His work for the agency itself remains secret. So there's a bond between them. So it seemed fairly clear to me that the reason he never pressed the issue, the reason that he never demanded that someone came forward, the reason he never wrote about this in any of his voluminous writings, was that he couldn't. Because to do so would not only violate the basic oath that he had taken, violate, even more importantly, the basic understanding he had with people, it would jeopardize his standing. I think I mentioned earlier that he went bankrupt, I think in about 1934, 35, never got out of bankruptcy. And yet from that period, for the last dozen years of his life, he managed to keep, he lived in relative comfort. He wasn't rich by any means, but he had a roof over his head and somebody was paying the rent. And he was eating on a regular basis and he was well clothed. He lived rather comfortably, even though he had no perceptible income. Oh, and yes, the other thing by that time, he also received a weekly packet of heroin because by this period in his life, he was a stone cold junkie. And remained so until his death. So where did all his money come from? He earned very little off of his writings. A small amount came there, but it's pretty clear that he's receiving subsidies of the kind. And I don't just mean subsidies in terms of money. That's not a large outlay of money. But subsidies in terms of certain considerations which he received from authorities. I'll give you an example of that. So remember, he said that in the First World War, he arrives in New York. Oh, and this is the best part of the detail. Yeah, he arrived in New York right after the start of the First World War. He arrived on the 31st of October, 1914. That is Halloween. What could be the better date? Aboard the Lusitania, okay, which in a few months' time was to be very notoriously sunk off the coast of Ireland. So he arrives in New York in Halloween 1914 aboard a doomed ship. Now, I'm going to dismiss most of that as coincidence, but who knows? It's just one of the ways the universe works, I suppose. And he remained there until December 1919. So keep in mind, while Britain was at war, while 900,000 British soldiers were killed in the course of that war, Aleister Crowley was seemingly quite safe and secure, again, usually without any visible means of support in America. So he was there when America was neutral, and he remained after the U.S. entered the war. As we noted, when the Americans began suspicious of him, the British authorities warned him off. Now, he then returned on the 21st of December 1919 to his native England, a country he hasn't been to for about 5 years. Now, you might assume that with his background, and by the way, his writings for the fatherland had been published and disseminated, and people, Scotland Yard, MI5, had copies of them. They weren't, it wasn't as if the British officialdom had somehow missed the fact that Aleister Crowley has been writing German propaganda. Now, they all knew about it. So they were quite aware of that. And yet, these things happen. In order to return to England from New York, he had to visit the British consulate. Now, we know the British consulate was the same group that said they knew about him, but he had to visit the British consulate, and he had to visit the passport control office because his passport from 1914 was no longer valid. At the very least, it had to receive a new visa so that he could return because passports and regulations had changed during the war. Well, he goes to the British consulate, which was then at 44 Whitehall Street in Lower Manhattan, and he goes to the passport control office, and guess what? He gets a clear ticket home. And he gets on the liner, the SS Lapland, and he takes that across the Atlantic, and he lands at Plymouth, and he gets off, and then guess what happens? Nothing. He's not questioned. He's not, there's nothing exceptional about his entry. He simply comes back to the country that he had left, comes in very quietly, goes to see his favorite aunt and has Christmas dinner with her and is in the country for a while. What happens after a short period of time is that the British press, which of course didn't have a positive view at all, in fact, it's the press which dubbed him the wickedest man in the world. He kind of liked that at the time, but it wasn't actually a name he gave himself. The British press catches on that apparently this traitor, this slacker is in the country. What's the government going to do about it? And whammo, he is out across the channel into France very quickly. Remember, he's not arrested. In fact, he's out of the country before most of these articles appear. Now, so how did this take place? Was this some huge lack of oversight? Was it a tremendous mistake somehow? I mean, did British officials in New York mistakenly give him a new papers to get home? Did British officials at the port mistakenly allow him in? Did British officials mistakenly allow him to leave the country? No, none of this was a mistake. Because the passport control office at the British consulate in New York was directly controlled by British intelligence. In fact, the man who supervised it was a fellow by the name of Norman Graham Thwaites. And Norman Graham Thwaites was, first of all, the right-hand man, the number 2 of what, he didn't use the name MI6, but what would be known today as MI6, British Secret Intelligence Services, stationed in New York. He's the number 2 man in that. That's why he's running the passport control office. His immediate superior was a fellow by the name of Sir William Wiseman. Very interesting figure in his own right. So what Crowley did, when he went to the passport control office, you're walking into the lion's den of British intelligence in New York. They are the ones. In other words, it wasn't some, overburdened passport clerk who didn't know who this guy was. They knew exactly who he was. And in fact, Norman Thwaites knew exactly who Crowley was because he had met him before in New York. He was fully aware of who he was. So they facilitate him going back in the same way that the officials at Plymouth were quite aware of who he was. And in the same way, the British officials who almost certainly gave him a heads up that things are going to get, you should get out of the country because there's going to be a scandal if you stay here. Christmas dinner is over. Knew exactly who he was. None of this was done out of ignorance. But this would be the prime example of Crowley getting consideration, of getting a pass on things, of getting almost a kind of subsidy that really only makes sense if you realize that these people were his employers or that there was a relationship between them. And that's one of those things that on and off goes through much of his life. I certainly, in the book, I don't argue that he's necessarily the best spy or the most careful one. In fact, one of the things anybody who reads it is that in the early 1920s, he shows up in Italy. One of the most famous or infamous episodes is that he starts what I think today would be called a commune at basically an abandoned farmhouse on the northern coast of Sicily called the Abbey of Thelema. It's still almost a pilgrimage site for many people today, and or at least who or fans of Aleister Crowley.
The Thelmites.
And he set up his pardon?
I said the Thelmites.
Yes, Thelemites. That's where the term Thelemite comes from. The Abbey of Thelema was going to be his sort of grand church and community. Even as a commune, it was pretty much a dismal failure. Okay, so again, like most of the ventures he had, one thing that Aleister Crowley was ever a businessman. I don't think anybody could accuse him of having a practical entrepreneurial bone in his body. So it was, but it created, what was going on there? Well, I don't know, occultism and free love, which in the 20s was far more salacious than it is today, and sort of, if nothing else, cemented his reputation as a corrupter of men, women, and children. But the other aspect of this is that what eventually happened to him is that the Italian authorities, the fascist Italian authorities, in early 1923, soon after Benito Mussolini came to power, kicked him out of Italy, expelled him. They didn't kick out everybody else in the commune, but they were after him. They were not simply trying to shut down a bunch of British weirdos that are hanging out practicing free love and magic. They wanted to get Aleister Crowley out of the country, and they did. But one of the things that is then mentioned in some of the Italian reports is that one of the things that they found were British intelligence documents among his papers. That, I'd argue, was a major mistake on his part. That was a real breach of tradecraft, because you're not supposed to leave things like that lying around for people to find, because that's incriminating. Again, if they simply think that you're a moral reprobate and you want you out of the country for that reason, well, as far as the British government is concerned, that's okay. That all sort of adds to your cover. On the other hand, if they start going through your papers and they find out that you, occultist moral reprobate, also somehow have British documents in your possession, that gets a little tricky. So there was one of the things that, so what possible purpose could he serve there? Well, one of the things that everyone was interested in was, what was this new fascist government going to be like? What was the attitude of the population? What sort of other material could be picked up by people who came and went? There was a kind of continual procession of people who were coming and going from the Abbey. It was a seemingly insignificant base from which many things came. This isn't to argue that it wasn't a real commune and there weren't actual occult activities going on. There certainly were. There's nothing mutually exclusive about that. But it was also a cover by which other agents could be brought in and out of the country, and which Crowley could coordinate intelligence gathering materials throughout Italy. The British had a strong interest, by the way, in Mussolini. And one of the reasons for that, as I think was only revealed within the last decade or so with the declassification of some old MI5 files, is that guess who else also had been, at least for a time, a British intelligence asset? Benito Mussolini. In fact, during the First World War, the British paid Mussolini to write anti-German pro-war propaganda to try to bring Italy into the war. They hit him on. like a monthly contract. He had worked for them. So there's an interesting sort of flip side to this, that, in this case, Mussolini is writing propaganda, Crowley is writing propaganda. It all fits into the same picture. So now a fellow who had been a British intelligence asset some years before, had started this militant movement, and guess what? Taken over the Italian government. There's every reason in the world why Crowley and undoubtedly other British agents would want to have a very careful eye on what he was doing. And almost certainly what happened is that Mussolini or someone else suspected as much, and that's why they wanted him out of the country. They didn't know exactly what he was doing, but they weren't concerned about any of the moral implications of his occultism. If they were concerned with that, they would have obliterated the entire commune. They were concerned with him as a potential British spy. But that episode, his failure to really observe protocol and to leave those documents lying around, pretty clearly after that, for many years after that, made him a kind of, his name was mud in some respects. You can still see it come up. There's a case that happens, also I think recounted in the book, a few years after that. There's an exchange by some people within the sort of mid-levels of British intelligence, and one of the things they're concerned about is essentially secret societies, what they believe are occult secret societies operating in the political realm in the Far East. And what they're really talking about are some Japanese and Chinese secret societies. And the question came up, is that, well, do we have anybody who knows anything about this? Is there someone who might have some insight in it? And one fellow comes forward and he goes, well, I know this is, I almost don't want to bring this up, but Aleister Crowley would probably be the person who could give some insight on that. And that, again, was kind of a revelation, because why would, again, you might assume that they wouldn't even know who he was. Well, they do. They already had passed acquaintance. In other words, they're not simply pulling his name out of the ether that, well, somebody might know something about occultism. The newspapers say this guy is an occultist, so we'll ask him. No, they knew quite well what he was. They knew his reputation. They knew his past behavior, his successes and his failures. So why would they even consider him? Because it was a specialized question that he was one of the few people that they considered qualified to answer or even to explore.
Interesting. And also with Crowley being so, I guess you could say, mystical and very good with hypnosis and able to control scenarios and situations well, wasn't there somebody behind him that actually got him to that level and helped his name get out there to the masses?
You're talking about someone who, in terms of,
like, took his books and published his books and stuff like that. I mean, there's a key factor. I heard his name one time before, and I can't remember who it was, that actually got the information released later and kind of kept his name alive.
There are a couple of people. At the time, you're talking about Israel Regardie.
I know who he is, and no, there was somebody else.
No.
But
Gerald York.
That's who.
Okay, and guess what Gerald York had links to? Remember when I said that you go around Crowley, you keep tripping over people who have intelligence links?
Oh, yeah.
Gerald York is another one.
Okay. Tell us about that.
Well, York, again, is someone from respectable British establishment background, had a military commission, but York is one of those people, especially during the 1920s, who is... in the late 1920s, when Crowley's in this kind of native, the period between being kicked out of Sicily in 1923 and then in 1929, when Crowley is kicked out of France. Okay, so he gets kicked out of Italy, sort of dives in full-blown into his heroin addiction. He's one of those people who sort of, kicked it and went back to it throughout much of his life. And it seems to be a very low point in his life, and he's mostly living in Paris. York is one of those people who sort of shows up, you can look at it this way, to sort of bail. He's a kind of guardian angel in some respects. Towards the end of the 1920s, there was an attempt to sort of stabilize Crowley's finances by publishing and getting some of his books in print. That, too, also turned out to be a failure. Almost none of these ventures worked, but York was helping him there. York's role in that period, to me, looks very much like a case officer's role. And I think that in some way is the type of person that you were referring to. That, remember, Crowley is an asset. And case officers are generally more professional intelligence employees, officers, who run assets, who control a number of agents they manage them. They are the managers of assets, I guess that's one way to put it. And in Gerald York in this period, which isn't to say that York wasn't his friend. It isn't to say that he didn't actually have some personal concern for him, that he wasn't really trying to help him. But that doesn't rule out that this also isn't part of his assignment as well, to essentially shepherd and watch Crowley. Now, why would they need to watch him? If he'd screwed up in Sicily and he'd sort of been put off on the shelf and ignored, then why do you need to watch him? Well, because he knows things. So what if Crowley decides that he is going to tell everything? You know, what if he decides he's going to write about his wartime experiences? What if he starts naming names? That could be an embarrassment. So you can't entirely take someone like that and just throw them to the wolves or forget about them, because that becomes dangerous. If you take someone who has that kind of knowledge and you cut them off from any kind of support and you refuse to have anything to do with them, well, they again might very likely take into their head that they have nothing to lose except by capitalizing on the information that they have. So you really only have two choices in that situation. Either you terminate them or you keep them on a string. And that is what someone like York did. Later on in the 30s, that role seems to be taken over by a really sort of mysterious figure by the name of Robin Thyne, Thyne, or Nne. And Robin Thyne, again, is one of these people who at first just appears to be someone who's, you know, a Crowleyite, someone who's interested in mysticism and finds Crowley to be a kind of guru. And yet you really find that Thyne's pretty much in control of the situation. That he's kind of managing Crowley, overseeing him in that respect. Another person who may have played a role like that was a somewhat better known British agent, a fellow by the name of Maxwell Knight. And Maxwell Knight actually was known as M, worked at various times for both MI6 and MI5. And yeah, to make this distinction, I think many of your listeners know this, but MI6, actually the Secret Intelligence Service, there is no MI6, there's the Secret Intelligence Service, which pretends it's MI6, is the British Foreign Intelligence Service. That is, they're involved in spying abroad. MI5, the Security Service, is roughly the equivalent of the FBI. They are the counterintelligence or internal security service. And just in case you imagine that they don't necessarily talk to each other that much or know who others' agents are, that's absolutely true. In some cases, it may be to the interests of MI6 to have MI5 be actively suspicious of some of its assets. Why? Well, because if someone else is looking at that and they notice that this, let's say, for instance, that you're trying to infiltrate one of your assets into an enemy spy ring. Well, those people are going to be suspicious of it. Therefore, the mere fact that MI5 is suspicious of this person would seem to confirm, that would suggest that the British government couldn't possibly be interested in them. That's what was, by the way, back in New York in World War I was going on. One of the reasons why the Germans in New York were willing to accept Crowley, one of the reasons, is because the British publicly were manifestly suspicious of him. In fact, if you look at a kind of general description of him that was written up by the British Intelligence Office in New York and circulated, has nothing good to say about him at all. Has nothing specifically bad to say about him, except that he appears to be a kind of dissolute character, untrustworthy, connected with German agents. I mean, same things that were all, in many ways, quite true, but which, see, it was to the interest of the same British officials to publicly smear his reputation and put him under suspicion as it was privately to assist him. It's the same people doing this. Publicly, they will vilify him and keep their distance from him. Privately, of course, he's working for them. And once that sort of relationship is understood, these things that don't appear to make any sense do, at least in their own way. The other reason, going back to that the Germans were willing to accept him was because of the occult angle. And that actually goes back a few years before to around 1910, years before the First World War breaks out. And this is actually when Crowley was initiated into the OTO, into the Ordo Templi Orientis. This is an organization that survives today. There are different groups of it, and most of them don't get along. Um, that is, there are different people who claim the title of OTO, but Crowley certainly basically became the central figure in that organization, but he wasn't at the time. The OTO was originally a German occult organization, founded by Germans in Germany and Austria, and the key figure in this was a guy by the name of Theodor Reuss. And it was Reuss who initiated Crowley into the OTO, who introduced him into the organization that Crowley would later basically take over, and sort of granted him this grandiose title of being the head of the order for the British Isles and most of the English-speaking world, including America. So this is why, in 1914, Crowley could show up in America, and along with everything else, he could claim to be the head of the OTO, of the Ordo Templi Orientis, for North America. And who has put me in charge of this? Well, a German, Theodor Reuss. This is a German secret society. Now, here's the other kicker to it. Guess what else Theodor Reuss worked for during the war and previously? German intelligence. So here we have the same pattern. Theodor Reuss, who is a German spy in Britain, now initiates into his German secret society someone who he thinks is a good recruit and esoteric brother, but who is also a British agent. In fact, it doesn't take too much to figure, if you put the dots together, that when Crowley made Royce's acquaintance, when he cultivated him and got him to bring him into his organization, what he was doing was infiltrating a German spy ring within Britain, because that's what Reuss was running there. That's what he was doing in Britain before the war. He was running a spy ring. And guess what? He now managed, we'll assume unwittingly, you never know about these things, to bring a British agent into his organization. That British agent, a few years later, then sort of capitalizes upon this to go to New York, where he's now, also out of the blue, he just styles himself as an Irish nationalist. So there's something to be explained here. Crowley is not Irish. I'm not sure he even went to Ireland. No of the real Irish nationalists in New York ever seem to have known what to make of him or had anything to do with him. But the Germans, let's sort of accept him as that. But the real key to his acceptance by the Germans, though, was that who are the Germans going to turn to ask that we've got this guy, this Englishman, maybe he's an Irishman, we're not sure, Crowley, who shows up and he wants to work with us. He says that he hates the British crown and he wants to assist the German cause. Well, they're not just going to accept him at his word, are they? They're going to try to find somebody who can vouch for him. And they've got someone who can vouch for him. Theodor Reuss, the German intelligence agent who had initiated Crowley into the OTO some years before. So you see this whole pattern here of sort of gaining confidence of one person in order then to gain the confidence of someone else. So it's his whole relationship with Reuss and the OTO. It's his membership in a German occult organization headed by a German intelligence agent, Reuss, who then provides the basis for Crowley to infiltrate a German organization in New York. In that respect, he was quite good at it. And that's something that, if you don't understand these connections, that is, if you don't understand the occult connections and the intelligence connections of these people, it just appears to be a sort of random things that don't make particular sense. Put another way, it makes a disturbing amount of sense in many ways. So wherever you sort of follow him through his life, there is someone who is a guardian angel, a case officer, who is working with him. It's I went back. I mentioned earlier this fellow, the number two in the sort of MI6 apparatus in New York during the First World War, Norman Thwaites. Mm-hmm. I said it was Norman Thwaites, and I said that he'd known Crowley, and he'd given him his visa to get back to Britain. Well, we know that Norman Thwaites is a spy. No question about that. That's who he's working for. The other thing that's less obvious is that Norman Thwaites, as he readily admits in his later biography, always had an interest in spiritualism and seances. In fact, in his autobiography, there's a whole description of a seance which Thwaites attends sometime in 1917 or 1918, in which he and other people present use a Ouija board and a female medium to reveal a German spy ring. Now, he never mentions Crowley's name in the book, but of course, he never actually mentions, except for one person, anybody who was at this little gathering. And I would bet a reasonable amount of money, wouldn't bet the farm, wouldn't bet the house, but a reasonable amount of money, that Crowley was there. I suspect that he was probably giving stage directions to the whole seance that took place. So you see the same pattern. Norman Thwaites, British spy, but also a person at least very, very interested, if maybe only on an amateurish level, maybe more than an amateurish level, in occultism. And Aleister Crowley, occultist, who also just happens to be a British intelligence agent. So two men that otherwise would appear to have nothing to do with each other actually have two things that draw them together. These two things coincide. So this is the pattern that I tended to find over and over and over again. I guess, skipping again some more years to the late 1920s, I think I mentioned the fact that in 1929, Crowley's kicked out of France. Okay, he'd been living there as a resident foreigner, and by kicked out, what happens is that they pulled his they sort of pulled his green card. You have a permit to live as a foreigner in France, and they took it away and kicked him out of the country. And what did they kick him out for? You might wonder, did they expel him from France because he was an occultist, because he was suspected of Satanism, black man? There were things about him that in the press that appeared that way. No, they kicked him out for suspicion of espionage. So another case where Aleister Crowley is kicked out of a country for being a spy. That appears to be the instance, by the way, in which I think he came the closest to spilling the beans, because he gave some interviews to the French press in which he protested against, being a spy of any kind. And he said, that, and actually, what the French suspect him of is being a German spy. They had kind of mania about German spies, but that was what they seemed to suspect him of. And this is why I think he gives one interview where he goes, no, you understand that during the war, I was on the Allies, I spied for the Allies, I worked for the British. And he actually mentions the name of someone who he says could vouch for him. And this is a fellow by the name of Admiral Guy Gaunt. In fact, I think he mentions Gaunt's name on a couple. He gives him as a kind of reference. That's as close as I can tell that Crowley ever really gets to revealing any details about his work in New York years earlier. Because it's very interesting that he mentions Guy Gaunt. And it's interesting that he would even know who Guy Gaunt was, because Guy Gaunt was not a terribly well-known personality. He was a British, he was a Royal Navy officer, and he'd served briefly in Parliament, but not a name that most people would be that he wouldn't pay much attention to. No, the reason he knows Guy Gaunt is that Guy Gaunt was the head of another branch of British intelligence in New York during World War I, British Naval Intelligence, the Admiralty's intelligence. So see, the British Admiralty, the Royal Navy, ran its own intelligence operation, and nothing to do with MI5 or MI6. In fact, again, they wouldn't speak to each other. And in fact, Gaunt, who had actually been the first senior British intelligence officer in New York, was basically displaced when people like Wiseman and Thwaites showed up. And there was, if you suspect there were tensions, there were. Crowley's main association, if you connect the dots, wasn't with MI6. It was with British naval intelligence. And Gaunt was probably his case officer in New York for much of this period, the guy that he would directly report to. And that, again, it makes sense that he would then name Gaunt. So remember, when he's saying that Guy Gaunt could vouch for me, he's talking about a man who was nominally the naval attaché in New York, but whose secret job was being the head of British naval intelligence. So that wasn't something that was publicly known, but it was clearly something that Crowley knew, and the only way he could know it, well, you can put those pieces together as well. So, he's kicked out of France. He has no money to speak of. And he comes back, or he's actually summoned back to London. And that's one of those things that's a kind of interesting turning point, because he clearly had been persona non grata in England for a number of years. But again, after this failure in Sicily, I think that he's almost never in England between about 23 and 29. He's been in exile. Now he's sort of called back. And one of the people that he calls back to see is a fellow by the name of, it's either Major or Colonel Carter, who works for Scotland Yard, which is also another internal security, maybe the most famous of all British police or security agencies. But it also turns out that Carter just doesn't work for Scotland Yard. He's also Scotland Yard's liaison man to, guess what, MI6. So he sort of works for both agencies, or at least he has some connection with both of those. He calls Crowley back and says, essentially allows him to return home, but also apparently has a job for him. And one of those jobs that he immediately dispatches on is that you can sort of earn your way back in if you go to Berlin and you hang out there for a while and you report on things like IRA activists who are, the Irish Republican Army that was perhaps in Berlin. Now, keep in mind, the Nazis have not taken power, but the Nazis are rising to power. So it's very interesting to note that Aleister Crowley is in Berlin, seemingly outwardly just hanging around, going to bars, having the occasional magic, ritual, consorting with prostitutes, the usual thing that a dissolute occultist would supposedly do. But he's also in one of the most important cities in Europe at one of the most important times in its history. The fall of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, and Aleister Crowley has a ringside seat for this. Now, why could he be useful? Certainly the British and others must have had all kinds of people collecting information on the Nazis. Who wouldn't be collecting information upon a party which has come from relative obscurity? This is one of those things I think is sometimes missed. Up until about 1928, the Nazis had really gotten nowhere. Okay? They were a fringe party. And then all of that really begins to change once the Depression comes along and you get to 1930, and that's when they get big. It shows up there exactly as the Nazis are beginning to rise. So what can he contribute to this that other spies couldn't? Well, there again, he can connect to certain currents. So one of the things you want to do if you're going to collect intelligence is you don't want to have it collected from one source. No, you never want to do that. You want to collect intelligence from as many different sources, as many different channels and perspectives as possible. And one of those perspectives that could be useful, that could provide something that others couldn't, is the sort of underground occult perspective. Now, one of the things that there's this almost cottage industry about today are the Nazis and the occult. Every time you turn out, it's the Nazis and the occult, Nazis and the occult. And that's one of those things which is a completely topic in and of itself. Is probably, more has been made out of than is really there, but there was something there. So whether or not Hitler had any interest in the occult, people around him like Rudolf Hess certainly did. Heinrich Himmler certainly did. So there were people, in other words, within the Nazi establishment, if not Hitler, people close to him, luminaries in this new rising party, who not only had interest in occult and esoteric topics, but then that meant that they had connections with other people who did so. And that's, again, another source of information. It's a whole other perspective upon those people, and you would want to try to get them, and they only get that perspective, and the person who would be perfectly positioned to do it, a man who had close connections to German occultists. Crowley had been in Germany in 1925. There were other initiations there. He had, I think, been married in Leipzig some years later. One of his most faithful followers, and in fact, the man who basically would take over as his heir in 1947, is a fellow by the name of Karl Germer, who was a German. Oh, and guess what Karl Germer worked for during the First World War? German intelligence.
Really?
See, every time you look at one of these guys, there's someone who's connected to it. It doesn't seem to have played a very important role, but then if he did, you wouldn't know either. So Germer, who also happens to have some background in German intelligence, is then very close to him. There's an angle here. There's something which isn't in the book, because, like a number of things, I didn't pay attention to it, really wasn't much aware of it at the time. But this period of, say, 1930 to 31, I think Crowley finally leaves Berlin in early 32. And he's certainly there most of the time in 30 and 31. He leaves and comes back. But that's sort of his base of operations. Well, if you look at Berlin in that period, maybe second to, maybe even more so than Adolf Hitler, one of the most famous names was a fellow by the name of Hannessen, of Erich Jan Hannessen. You ever heard of him?
No, I have not.
Okay, Erich Jan Hannessen. There are a couple of books out there. One, a very good one by Mel Gordon, and the title sort of reveals the key. Erich Jan Hannessen, Hitler's Jewish clairvoyant. So the thing about Erich Jan Hannessen is that, he really wasn't Erich Jan Hannessen. His real name was Herschel Steinschneider. And he was born in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what would today be the Czech Republic, and he was indeed Jewish. And he became, in this period, maybe one of the most well-known stage performers in Germany and in Central Europe. In fact, for several years, he'd built up this reputation as being a clairvoyant, a mind reader. What Hannesen did was basically a stage act. And like most stage acts, it was, a sophisticated con of one form or another, but he was very good at it. Which is to say that, I don't know, even people who knew Hannesen, who thought that he was largely fake, could never be sure that he wasn't entirely a fake. But he was very well known. The other thing that Hannesen was, he published a whole magazine devoted to astrology. He was not just a psychic and a mind reader. He was an astrologer. He was a prophet. Okay, he was all of these. In fact, he was seemingly more and more developing this whole sort of cult following around himself. Well, the interesting thing about Hannesen, this Jewish stage magician, is that he pretended that he was actually descended from Danish nobility. That's where the Hannesen name comes in. And he had sort of papered over his Jewish background, except it wasn't really papered over that much. It was very easy to figure out who he was. The name was well known. It took just the slightest effort to try to reveal that Erich Jan Hannesen didn't really exist, and that Hermann Steinschneider, whichever name he wanted to use, was the real person. Now, the interesting thing is that in Berlin, as the Nazis are rising, well, guess who he becomes friends with? Remember, he's a celebrity. That's the best way to think of it. Hannesen is a celebrity, and everybody wants to be seen with a celebrity. And among those were people like Count Helldorf. And Count Helldorf was head of what? The Brown Shirts in Berlin, the whole organization. And he is not only one of Hannesen's buddies, seen with him in public, but he also loans Hannesen, or I think Hannesen loans him money. Helldorf apparently had, a gambling habit, and Hannesen was doing quite well. So one of the things that he was later found to have were a number of IOUs that were owed to him by a number of German politicians, including prominent Nazis. But the Brown Shirts, the SA, the stormtroops, Helldorf was so proud of it that they actually make him an honorary member of the SA. Okay, now to keep in mind, this is a Jewish stage musician whose background is not well disguised, who is now a prominent public associate of Nazis. And not only that, he becomes a kind of Nazi prophet because it is Hannesen who predicts in early 1932 that the Nazis are going to win big. And they do. And that actually brings him to Hitler's attention. So one of the things that's still sort of a debate today is not whether or not Hannesen and Hitler met. They certainly did. But how many times they met and how far back their relationship went. In fact, there's at least one source, it's probably a typo, but you never know, that says that Hannesen and Hitler knew each other as early as 1922. Even if it was only 1932, Hannesen and Hitler did meet. There are a lot of stories associated with this. One is that all of the various sort of hand gestures and speaking skills, the sort of the theatrical aspects to Hitler's public performance was something that Hannesen taught him. There might be something to that. It's not the only explanation of it, because Hitler had been noted as an excellent public speaker as early as 1919, so it wasn't as if he didn't know how to speak and only picked it up later on. He'd been able to be an effective theatrical performer. But there is that element as well. It doesn't say that you can't always learn more. But it shows that Hannesen had sort of, in a sense, infiltrated or inveigled himself into the Nazi hierarchy, become quite favored. The main thing was that he predicted that Hitler would become chancellor, and guess what? He did. And then, shortly after Hitler comes to power, this again in January 1933, when Hitler becomes chancellor, one of the things, again, that I think often isn't appreciated, when Hitler becomes chancellor, he becomes chancellor under the German constitution, and that rather limited what chancellors could do. He doesn't simply get elected to become Führer. That's going to take a couple of years to happen. And one of the important steps in making that happen is the infamous Reichstag fire. I think a lot of listeners may have heard of that, and, maybe explaining the obvious, but the Reichstag is the German parliament, and what happened is that not long after the Nazis came to power, it burned. There was a fire which destroyed the building. The Nazis capitalized on this fire, what today we would call a false flag operation, setting it themselves, blaming it, or using as a patsy a Dutch communist, a fellow by the name of Martinez van der Lubbe. The other patsy they sort of perpetrated and argued it was all part of a Bolshevik plot, and then use this emergency to, guess what? Get emergency powers to eventually get through something called the Enabling Act, and that's the actual beginning of the Nazi dictatorship. That's what transformed Adolf Hitler from simply being a constitutional chancellor or prime minister with very limited and temporary powers into a man who would become the dictator to the country. Now, what eventually seems to have gotten Hanussen, where his psychic powers, might have proved a little dangerous for him, is that in a public forum, just before the Reichstag burned, he saw the burning of a great public building. And then guess what happens? The Reichstag burns. Well, I'm sure he didn't actually utter the words Reichstag, but everybody knew what he was talking about. And that again suggested, there's only two ways to interpret that. Either this guy has actual psychic powers, or he knew it was going to happen. Now that was a problem. And one of the things that then happens is that not long after it, guess what happens to Erich Jan Hanussen? He disappears. And not long after that, his decomposing body is found in the woods not too far from Berlin. All right, so the man who had been apparently a close friend and even associate of Hitler and other Nazis now apparently had become an embarrassment and was eliminated. That's the general way the story is told. There may be more aspects to it. Now, so how does this whole diversion fit back into Crowley? Remember I said that when Hitler is rising to power and Hanussen is at the peak of his fame, and Hanussen and Hitler are eventually brought together. Well, up until the middle part of 1932, who else is in town? Aleister Crowley. Now, one of the things that Crowley took an interest in, one of the things that supposedly he actually knew a good deal about, was stage magic. And this was the whole performance. He was very interested in people who did this, and one of the things that he realized is that it was basically sophisticated fakery. I think at one point he actually sort of, explained why even many occultists would sort of resort to fakery, and it's actually pretty simple when you consider it, is that fakery you can control. Okay? If you know the trick, if you master the trick, it will work every time. On the other hand, let's say that instead you're trying to achieve something by, I don't know, praying to some discarnate entity, okay, when you're trying to get a god or a demon or angel to do your bidding, and the problem with that, even if you believe in them, is that they have minds of their own, don't they? If you're trying to get a sentient being to assist you, well, you never know whether they're going to do it or not. So see, the whole thing is the trick is easy to manipulate. You learn the trick works all the time. If you're waiting for the gods to do it for you, well, the point is sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And from the standpoint of a stage performer, you just really can't depend upon that type of thing. So it's in some ways it's kind of crushed. But Crowley was always interested in watching these people perform. And the one thing that I have looked for since writing the book, and I'm still looking for, so if anybody out there listening knows about this, I'd love to hear about it, is that I can't believe that Crowley, living in Berlin, when Hanussen is in many ways the talk of the town, when his performances are sold, that Crowley would not have taken not only an interest, but an intense interest in this man. That's someone that he would at least wanted to see perform in some way. And what I actually find interesting is that in his diaries, and one of the things that Crowley did is he kept constant diaries about his activities, magical diaries, mentioning people he came in contact with. Unfortunately, he tends to refer to a lot of people in code. Sometimes he will mention people by name. In other cases, it's simply a code, something that he's developed for him, that only he would really know what it would mean. So the point is that in these diaries, he may mention Hanussen, but he never mentions him as Hanussen. And that's what I find more interesting. In a sense, the mention of Hanussen is conspicuous in his absence from Crowley's diaries. Because if it was something casual, if this was simply a popular entertainer who was active in Berlin, Crowley might have mentioned that he attended a performance or he thought he was a fraud or something, but he doesn't mention him at all. It's not in there. he doesn't mention at all someone that he must have taken note of. And then let's add this other factor to it. It's not just that Hanason is a stage performer purporting. See, from Crowley's standpoint, Hanason either, whether or not he's someone who certainly is giving the pretense of having mystical powers. And that is something else that would have attracted Crowley to see simply not whether they were there or what the tricks were. But now Hanason is becoming publicly associated with the Nazis. He's becoming the Nazis' prophet. Well, think of what one might, the more you could find out about Hanason, the more you could find out about the Nazis. And there's something else that Hanason liked to do for his close friends, very often wealthy people in Berlin, in the film industry, in the theater, in publishing. I mean, Hanason was his parties were the parties to go to. He had a big apartment in Berlin, which he fixed up and dubbed the Palace of the Occult. Okay, which everyone was going to be, and anybody who was anybody was invited to. He also had a yacht, and on those yachts he had parties, and those parties, and even parties out on the lot turned into orgies, and he filmed them. So one of the things that many people suspected that Hanason was running on the side, and I suspect they were entirely right, was a blackmail racket. So keep in mind, this is a guy, a celebrity who gets other celebrities, famous people who can be compromised, to get into positions, and then he films them in one sort of an act or another. And that might explain why he had a good deal of influence. So think of what an intelligence asset could potentially learn from someone like Hanason. What do you know about Hanason? You know that he is venal, that he's very interested in money. He can be bought. You know that he is morally flexible. This is a man who does not avoid, fakery, lying, blackmail. And the third thing you know is that he has intimate access to information about important people, especially political figures, including the rising stars of the Nazi Party. Now, any spy worth his salt would want to have access to it. So, somewhere, again, it's kind of a chapter yet to be written, hopefully, is this connection, which I am sure existed between Crowley. I mean, not a connection in friendship where they got together, and had strudel and coffee, but simply of Crowley in some way either infiltrating himself or getting someone else, getting some sort of insight into Hanason's circle as a way of extracting the information that Hanason had. If nothing else, taking a bag full of cash might well have accomplished that. And that's one of those chapters, I think, which is there. Hopefully, will be written at some point. It touches upon the bigger picture that it touches upon is the role, let's say, of foreign governments and intelligence agencies in the rise of the Nazis. This again is one of those things that, today, Aleister Crowley is an arch occultist and Satanist and the wickedest man in the world. A perpetually bald face staring at us from the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. He's become a kind of object of morbid fascination for most people. But almost nobody thinks about it in the sense of being a spy, of being an intelligence asset. In the same way, Adolf Hitler has been turned into the great gollywog of modern history. Right? Someone who is, in most people's minds, perpetually ranting with spittle coming out of the corners of his mouth, and an irrational man who we are told continually was the human embodiment of evil. Now, none of this, absolutely understand, is meant to try to redeem Adolf Hitler's reputation. He was very, very negative influence on things. But it doesn't necessarily require that one represent cosmic evil to simply be bad or to have a very bad impact on it. And what this sort of later mythologizing of these characters come to be is they turn them into caricatures. The historical Hitler that most people think of is a caricature. It's not the real person. The historical Aleister Crowley is a caricature. It's not the real person, which is generally more complicated than that. Hitler's described as evil, as a madman. There were probably all kinds of mental problems. The other thing he was a very cunning and effective politician. When I look at him, that's primarily what I see. A very cunning, amoral politician. And when others, people within the British, French, even Soviet, even American governments saw him, they saw him as, well, a kind of rough-edged figure, not necessarily someone that we would want at home, but they're looking at him as, is this a person who could bring some level of order to Germany? Is this a person whose rise to power would ensure that Germany not go communist? Because when you look again in that period, after 1929, Germany, more than any other country, was hit by the Depression, devastating unemployment, even far beyond any scale of which happened in the US, and that was bad enough. But Germany was hit, it was the epicenter of this world depression that took place. And that's what fueled the Nazi rise. People were out of work and they were dissatisfied and disillusioned with the existing parties, and the Nazis, if nothing else, were something new. Well, the only other alternative to them, let's say by 1930 and 1931, the next biggest party was the KPD, the communists. A communist Germany would have, well, revolutionized Europe in more ways than one. And there was almost no one in the political establishments in London or Paris or most any other European capital, except Moscow, who would want to see the communists come to power. The only political force in Germany that could prevent that was the National Socialist Party. The others were not capable of it, or they had failed. And therefore, there seemed to be a practical point to supporting the rise of these nationalists. The Hitler was going to take Germany in a direction. And this is the type of thing that people seem to be very astounded with today, is that, oh, well, this, so-and-so, trade, IT&T did business with the Third Reich, and Ford Motor Company did business with the Third Reich. Well, the truth is that every corporation that could possibly do it did business with the Third Reich, because they did business with Germany. You'll find that these companies did business in Germany before 1933, and they saw no reason why they shouldn't continue to do it after 1933. So they simply accommodated themselves to the new regime. To other people,
Kind of like Rome, right?
kind of like Rome. To other people, Hitler was the end. Things that there was no Second World War that had happened yet. There was no Holocaust that was going to happen yet. Apparently, prophecy once again, as usual, fails. But they saw what they wanted to see, and what they saw was someone that could stabilize Germany and prevent it from going communist. And they also, in some cases, saw someone who seemed to have admirable abilities to restore order to. I mean, the thing is, if you actually go back to the 30s and look at a lot of the commentary about Hitler, it's more positive than negative. Political figures, people in journalism, again, in Britain, elsewhere, saw something that they wanted to emulate in some respects. So
there's a lot of people, if I can just jump in for 1 second,
sure.
There's a lot of people that feel that the Holocaust numbers were actually inflated because of certain information that contradicts the numbers that have been told throughout some history books. And I don't know enough about that. Have you done any research into that aspect?
It's numbers, numbers, numbers. History is almost always about numbers, and the thing is that the more you look at them, the less definable they become. It is like trying to come up with an accurate number of how many people were killed in World War I, how many people were killed in World War II. All right, you can't. I mean, oddly enough, you would seem it would be relatively simple to simply calculate how many, but you can't come up with that. The Holocaust is the numbers have always varied. The number which is always sort of brought around is 6 million, and 6 million is a nice round number, and it has a nice round ring to it. It's not exact. There is no exact. It's not as if the Nazis killed Jews until they got to 6 million and stopped. All right. It comes into questions as to how many people. You can basically do this if you go through most countries in Europe in the 1930s. Generally had some sort of religious identifiers in their census data or in their issues of documentation. So if you go to Hungary, you go to Germany, you go to Austria, you go to Italy, you can determine from the people who declared themselves to be Jewish how many were there. So you can come up with a general picture of how many Jews, basically, not exactly, people who identified themselves as such or were identified by the governments that they lived in were there. And then you can do the same thing in 1946 and you can subtract the numbers. All right? So you know roughly how many there were in 1939, and then you know how many you find in 1946. Now, the basic subtraction that you'll get is somewhere between 5.2 and 5.9 million. And that, again, is because there are for instance, due to the fact that the Nazis killed people who they considered to be racial or biological Jews, as opposed to people who may in any way have identified themselves as such, then you can actually include people who wouldn't have been counted there. But it's somewhere between 5.2, generally between about 5.4 and let's say 6 million. 6 million is the sort of upper limit. 5.4 is probably the lower limit. That's where it is. There's a range. Okay. So if someone insists that there are 6 million people who die in the Holocaust, that's, there's no accounting. That's not a magic number. And it's maybe slightly on the high side. But this whole sort of argument as to whether it's 5.4, 5.5, 5.6, 5.7, we're talking over statistics. The point is that the murderous anti-Semitic policies of the Third Reich are pretty easy to document, and that there are a lot of people who are missing. But the point that I was trying to make is that in 1931, none of that has happened yet. I mean, okay. it's one of those things that the Second World War hasn't happened yet. I mean, there was an argument, you could make an argument that, well, look, Germany, okay, if Germany goes communist, the argument could be, there's definitely going to be a war, all right? That's going to embolden Stalin, he's going to have Germany on his side, all hell is going to break loose if Germany goes. And there would have been a war. At the same time, if Germany remains unstable, if it ends up under a military dictatorship of a bunch of revanchist, generals who want to ignite a war. I mean, think of it this way. Hitler would never have gotten his war if the German army hadn't given it to him. So the German general staff were the people who were really, on his own, he had no ability to make this happen. He could only make that happen if the entire military establishment of Germany supported him. And that's why they did it. The German army is never National Socialist. The German army is monarchist to the core. They despise him, most of them, and he despises them. But they both have the same goal in mind. They want to restore Germany's position in Europe. They want to reverse the verdict of 1918, which in 1940, for a brief period, that they do. So it's one of those things that Hitler couldn't have become, Hitler didn't become what he did and didn't do what he did because he was the devil incarnate. He was a man, nothing more than that. He was able to attain the power that he did and accomplish what he did because all along the way he was joined and abetted and facilitated by others.
Well, he was also a master hypnotist, kind of like we were talking about earlier with his conversational hypnosis skills. If you actually study his voice with the frequencies, it's just through the roof. It's off the charts. And people would just get in that mass hypnosis stage. I did research on hypnosis for a lot of years where if you've got a group of 100 or more people together and they're rioting or protesting, the actual IQ level of that group drops by at least 10 points oftentimes. Yeah.
And it comes back to this role, Crowley and hypnotism. Honnison and a hypnotist. He was a hypnotist as well, of course. And then you've got, was part of what Honnison was teaching Hitler, these mass hypnotic techniques. This argument that magic rituals, that occult rituals are essentially simply hypnotism. Well, just extrapolate that. What is the Nuremberg rally? The famous thing that we almost see Hitler speaking around, these huge rallies with torchlight parades and symbolism. It's a big occult ritual, isn't it? Except now it's done publicly. It's Absolutely. Not occult anymore. It's simply what is essentially an occult ritual, which is now turned into a public rally. But it's accomplishing much the same thing on a larger and larger scale. So maybe that's another way to think about this weaponization of magic or the weaponization of occultism, that we can take it from being something that you would use to manipulate, 15 people in a cellar somewhere or in a room, instead of taking this same ability, this ability to project control in order to capture people's minds, to literally mesmerize them, instead of just a small group of people gathered around an altar somewhere, instead thousands of people gathered around an altar at Nuremberg, and then through radio and television and film to project that to millions of people across an entire country. The weaponization of occult technique. Again, one of those things.
Just like Hollywood, right?
Just like Hollywood. There you go.
I didn't mean to interrupt there. That was coming
No.
to my mind because they've really mastered those MK Ultra techniques, and now they can put it on the big screen and, like you said, have these global rituals and push agendas. I find it fascinating if you look at a lot of the parallels of World War II in Germany and things that are going on today in our own country here. I used to be a lot more nervous about martial law, roundups, FEMA camps, taking away our rights and basically pulling people in the middle of the night that might be outspoken out of their house with hoods over their heads and black Suburbans going off into the middle of nowhere, etc. And now I kind of look at it as they use these tactics as control mechanisms to keep people in fear. If they really want somebody to disappear, they're going to disappear. There's really nothing that person can do about it because there's so much power and influence with the electronics and the surveillance system and satellites and everything else. If you want to hide, good luck. It's going to be pretty tough unless you're in the middle of the rainforest. But, I do see a lot of parallels. What do you think about that kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, let's look at the basic reality that's admitted. Our own government, since 2001, has been engaged in renditions, which means that they have kidnapped people without any kind of open judicial process, taken them to secret prisons, black sites, tortured them in order to extract information, and people simply disappear into these things. I mean, the one place that we know about is Guantanamo. And, I mean, what is that exactly? It's a thing which exists outside the American judicial system in which foreigners, in which people apparently, as far as we know, have never been actually charged with. This isn't to argue that everybody there isn't exactly guilty of what it is that they're accused of. But the only thing you really know is that because they're there, they're apparently accused of something. But on the other, there is this argument that it's a kind of creepy and dangerous precedent in which a government, particularly the one that you live under, has basically taken on the power that it can indeed snatch anyone it wants out of their beds in the middle of the night, take them off to a secret prison, and do whatever it wants to them for any period of time. I mean, that already exists. That isn't something which is fantasy. That's something which is done. So how much is it then conceivable that you could ramp that up, that even larger number of people, that you could turn, Guantanamo into larger Guantanamo? I mean, I'm not saying any of this is going to happen, but it could. There's nothing that actually prevents it. It's not some sort of completely unrealistic fantasy. You can't even argue that, no, your government doesn't do that type of thing. It doesn't violate basic human rights. It does, routinely. I mean, not only that, I mean, let's face it, what the whole sort of drone assassination program is about is the ability of the U.S. government and any other government to do it to essentially murder anyone it wants without having to present a shred of evidence anywhere in the world. That's what it means. That you can, through drones or other means, kill anyone you want without providing any justification for it anywhere in the world. It's the ultimate murder incorporated.
It's mind-boggling when you put it that way.
And it is that's actually a pretty scary thing. You can always argue that, well, we have to do these things because the bad guys are so much worse, but, they are. But you're sort of getting drugged down with them in this way. The thing about these, it's like the genie in the bottle time. Once you have released the genie from the bottle, once you have given that kind of power to do these things, how do you take it back?
I don't know.
Because it was never given publicly. Nobody ever voted to give them these powers. I'm not even sure when people who approve things like the Patriot Act or anything else really realized the implications of what they were doing. But we don't know. Secret courts, secret prisons, secret indictments, murder of anyone who is deemed to be a threat to what exactly? The state, the American way of life. We're told that. So that, and keeping in mind that we now all wake up every morning expecting to read about some horrible atrocity that has taken place somewhere to the point that we really don't notice them much anymore. It almost makes me wish, I'm old enough that I can remember now, almost with nostalgia, the Cold War and the constant looming threat of thermonuclear annihilation. And I would say that on the whole, that was much easier to live with and in some ways far more comforting than a world of terrorism from both sides. I mean, in order to, to defeat terrorism, one must ultimately become a terrorist. One must embrace those things. So there's a reason to be afraid of government. There's a reason to be afraid of terrorism.
And do you think that it's going to get better or worse as far as personal freedoms are concerned?
Well, I wish I could say that we would all wake up and this would disappear. It would all be some kind of bad dream. And I could try to look at was a bright side in this, but I unfortunately I think the reality you need to confront is this. If you look at the general trend of human rights in this country and elsewhere, and you look at it over the course of the last 10, 20, even 30 years, it has degraded. It has almost never improved. Rights tend to deteriorate. And that's not to say that that process is irreversible, but I don't know by exactly what process or power that reverse would be taken. Because it seems to be a general trend which, our political systems and those who control it have basically accepted as a kind of necessity and a way of life. And I don't see any prospect that it's going to be thrown out of the window anytime soon. Is one of those things, without getting all sort of preachy about it, which I was just like, people tend to take human rights or basic rights for granted, and I think more so Americans, perhaps more so than anybody else, does that. But they're not. They can disappear very quickly. They can disappear as quickly as someone showing up, putting a bag over your head, and you ending up in a black site in Poland or wherever else they have it. Now, most people go, I would never do anything that would cause that to happen. The point is, what do you have to do for that to happen? See, when you have secret courts, if there even are courts, that can bring up indictments for the indefinite detention and imprisonment of people, and you don't even know what that's for, then how do you know you didn't do it?
Exactly.
I think you can be, you can really sort of descend into sort of paranoid alarmism in this, but it's not, it's not paranoia if they actually are out to get you or can. That's actually called pronoia. That's where you do have reasonable fear of these things happening. And I think even in terms of one's, public security, any kind of large public event, you got to think about it. You attend any sort of large public event these days, anything where there are hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people around, well, you're in what's called a rich target environment. And I think you need only look at what happened just a few days ago in Nice, France, to appreciate what that means. And that was where, on Bastille Day, a public holiday, where hundreds of people were out simply, celebrating or just walking around, that was an opportunity for a single terrorist in one truck to use that to slaughter as many people as possible. So again, that's one of the sort of current realities. Anytime large numbers of people get together in a public venue, there's a danger which is involved, and a danger which 30 years ago, 40 years ago, no one would have thought about, but which now you have to constantly think about in that way. So to what degree would this idea of sort of creating this climate of perpetual instability and fear, of creating a kind of generalized paranoia in the public, then that, of course, leads into a desire to mitigate that as much as possible, which means more repressive and secretive measures that then create their own kind of paranoia. So I don't know. I guess what is it you want? What's the paranoia of your choice? Do you want to take the chance of being blown up by Islamic terrorists, or do you want to take the chance of ending up in a FEMA camp, if that would exist? All right?
Well, they keep people on edge. They have that
Yeah.
fear factor where they can control you easier. And if you're on that fight or flight mode, well, they know where you're going to go. They know what you're going to do. And certainly it seems like election years, this ramps up. Every 4 years, there's all this fear, hysteria. People are worried about martial law, earthquakes, Planet X, aliens coming out and abducting them. It's the election years are really the big years where people are just, am I going to lose my job? What's going to happen? Are they going to come after my guns? Am I going to have to go to a concentration camp? And I've seen that cycle since 2000 at least. So
Oh, yeah.
I certainly find it fascinating. And a lot of people think, and they say this every time, I hear every 4 years, well, the elections are going to be halted and there's going to be martial law.
I just had someone the other day who was insisting that was going to happen, and I could probably be accused of in some ways it's the boy who cried wolf. I mean, again,
You're right.
I've heard that again for every election, at least probably over the last 20 years. Are they going to be canceled? Well, it hasn't. Doesn't say it couldn't happen, but it hasn't happened, and it's probably not. The aliens are going to land. Well, it could happen, but it's probably not. Okay. I mean, most of these fears are the common things we have. You know, it's like they're going to confiscate all the guns. Well, you know, they again, that's not impossible, but it's probably not going to happen. Um, and if it does, would happen. Things to watch for aren't the things that happen suddenly. They're the things that happen incrementally. And I think in some cases, accidentally or not, by constantly focusing people's attention on some sort of acute threat, that we miss the little thing. I mean, this is how rights erode. Okay, Americans' rights have eroded not because there was a bill passed, a specific bill in Congress, or there was a decision or a public announcement that these rights will be taken away or be mitigated. This happened incrementally, very small over a period of time. It is a gradual erosion, and that's what sometimes this focus upon these acute fears, most of which really are imaginary. Um, you know, most of what we tend to be afraid of, we are either afraid of. I think we're often sort of afraid of the wrong things, or the threat presented is actually appears to be much greater than it actually would be. I mean, again, yes, is jihadist terrorism a threat? It is, and it strikes catastrophically in certain places, but it's not a generalized threat. That is, of all the public gatherings that take place, almost none of them have terrorists that show up, and of course, but it only takes that happening in a few instances for that to create the fear, to create the perception of concern. And I think the question in all of this is, of course, is the degree to which these things just happen and people respond to them, and the way in which, again, they're being manipulated or exploited in some degree. That's the mystery.
Right. And also, you have a book you're writing right now. I think it's going to be released pretty soon, called Wall Street and the Russian Revolution.
Well, I'm still writing it. Got a contract for it, still writing it, and I want it to come out next year, 2017, because, well, the obvious 100th anniversary, right?
Right.
You don't want to miss that. Um, yeah, I don't know, what is that, what is it that I guess the question would be was, what is it, Spence, that you could say that Anthony Sutton didn't? Well, I can name more names and give more connections. It's a very, it's a complicated story. I got to admit that, it's got a lot of names and it's got a lot of numbers. And it's one of those projects where there is that very fine line. There's two ways you can, this again is something, is in the story and sometimes in class or something, trying to present something. The question is, do I want to oversimplify this? I mean, you want to avoid oversimplifying. At the same time, you want to avoid overcomplicating. And both of those are relatively easy to do. And the tricky part again is finding that kind of balance between them. That really, as I'm working through and putting this manuscript together, is what I'm trying to do. But there's no way of getting around it. It's not a simple story. It doesn't conform to a sitcom situation. It's not an episode of 24. Maybe that's a good way to put it. You don't have a simple story. There are a number of factors and people that play into it. But it's, I guess the question comes down to it, if the answer was Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, well, that name seemed to suggest is that there was a relationship, if nothing else, was a causal or symbiotic relationship between American finance capital, which is pretty much what we mean by Wall Street, American bankers and industrialists. And did these people, who were ostensibly all arch capitalists, facilitate a revolution in the Russian Empire which brought to power the world's first radical socialist regime? And with that, communism, and with that, basically the next 70 years of world history, and it still has an impact. But the repercussions from that are still going on. Now that again is one of those things that on the surface of it just seems, well, nutty. So why would capitalists, okay, people who would apparently have everything to lose if they brought radical socialists to power, well, why would they abet that? That just seems to be completely contrary to what would be in their own best interests. Well, the simple answer to it, along with the simple answer to most other things, is that it's about money. Okay, I mean, this is one of those things that you often like to think, well, there's more to things than money. Well, very often in the real world there isn't. And the money angle in it is that, well, it's something you can see today. The destabilization of a government, the deliberate destabilization of a government, with the result not necessarily of establishing a government, but of creating chaos, of dismantling its economic and political structure so that it can be reorganized or more effectively exploited. That was what was basically going on. And again, you look at it, the thing about the Russian Empire back in 1917, as many ways with the Russian Federation today, it's still shorn of some of the territories, the Ukraine and others. It's still the biggest country in the world, and it's still probably the world's single largest storehouse of every form of mineral wealth that exists. The problem with Russia back in the early 20th century is that it was assumed that because of its backward political system and it therefore had a backward economy, and that all this wealth could not be effectively exploited. So keep in mind, there were people both within Russia, that is, capitalists, entrepreneurs, people who viewed themselves as progressive reformers, who also agreed that the Tsar's regime needed to be gotten out of the way as a kind of antiquated structure so that Russia could be modernized and rationalized. And there were people in the United States and other countries who agreed with that view. This eventually all came to a head during World War I, when the decision in London and Paris and eventually in Washington was that the Tsar's government was not effective in waging the war against Germany. It wasn't particularly effective. And we need to replace that with a government that will be more effective. And that's what really happened. And this again, I'm sure many of your listeners know this, but in 1917, there are two revolutions, not one. The first revolution occurred in March, the second one in November, because the Russian calendar is different. There's something called the February and October. The reason the October Revolution occurs in November is by the Russian calendar at the time it was October. But there's a revolution that occurs in March, and there's one that occurs in November. The one in March is the one which overthrows the monarchy. That has nothing at all to do with the Bolsheviks. Okay? This is the one thing I've told students in my Russian history course, is that, if you come out of this, the one thing you should know is that Lenin didn't overthrow the Tsar. And if you don't know that, I'll flunk you. I haven't had to do that with anybody. But instead, who overthrew the Tsar? Well, who overthrew the Tsar were people within his own political establishment. They were nominally parliamentarian liberals. He was overthrown by self-described Russian liberals, with only a couple of token socialists along for the road, and rather moderate socialists at that. So the people who overthrew Tsar Nicholas were not the Bolsheviks. They weren't revolutionaries of any kind. They were men who sat in the parliament that he had created and who basically schemed against him to get him out of the way as an ineffective ruler, and they took over. And then if you look at the response to Washington and to Wall Street, by the way, in terms, again, of American finance capital, couldn't have been happier about that. And this is one of the things it's amazing what you can find if you simply go back and read the newspapers of the day. And it doesn't mean that everything you read in an old newspaper article is correct. Very often it's full of all kinds of things that are wrong, but it tells you what people thought at the time. It tells you what the perception of it was. And the perception on the American, capitalist scene was that the fall of the Russian monarchy was the best thing since sliced bread. And this was going to not only help the Russians fight more effectively, it certainly was going to open up all kinds of wonderful opportunity for advancement. So when you keep that in mind, was there a reason for American financiers or for American money to contribute to the overthrow of the Tsarist government? Absolutely. And, the reason why capitalists invest in anything is with the expectation of what? Return. And that's what it was. Okay, there was an investment in political destabilization and change with the idea of ultimately reaping the rewards of the advantages of the resources that would be made available to you. Now, here's where the rub comes in. The other thing which tends to be greatly underestimated or often forgotten about in history, the real, in some ways, almost motive engine of history, is not calculation. It's not conspiracy. That's, history is largely pretty much conspiracy. I mean, anytime a small group of people get together in private and make a plan of any kind, it is, technically a conspiracy. So that's, most political history. But that's not what happens is the law of unintended consequences. And the law of unintended consequences is that if you or I or anyone sets out to change one variable, okay, we don't like this and we're going to get rid of it. Okay, we don't like the Tsar's government because we think it's backward and inefficient and stupid, so we're going to overthrow it. Well, the problem is that once you alter one variable, you have altered many others, and you don't know what those are. And what happened in Russia's case is that you had one plot favored and facilitated by outside influences, not just American, which got rid of the old regime, replaced it with another government, which it turns out didn't really have the power or credibility or people to hold things together, and it all began to unravel and spiral out of control, and 8 months later led to the seizure of power by what 8 months before had been a marginal revolutionary group, really a group on the fringe of the revolutionary left in Russia. But somehow this had emerged from nowhere. I mean, Lenin was not anybody on the world scene before this. He wasn't even the dominant figure in the Russian revolutionary movement. Most of the Russian revolutionaries opposed him. But he then becomes a beneficiary of this law of unintended consequences. Well, then what happens? You engineer the fall of one regime, or you facilitate it in some way. Or you place your bets on it, you expect a return, and that doesn't work out, and now you've not got this new group coming along. So what do? Do you oppose them, or do you work out a deal with them? And in many cases, the idea made much more sense to work out a deal. And this, again, is one of the things that you begin to look at. Many of the key American emissaries who were there when the Bolsheviks take power are much more interested in working out some sort of modus vivendi with them than they are overthrowing them. And the other thing to keep in mind is that no, there had never existed in the world up to this type of thing, any such thing, not only of a revolutionary socialist regime, but any socialist regime. I mean, there were large, active socialist parties in all European countries in America. They didn't hold power anywhere. Power was something that was purely imaginary. I mean, this was something that socialists had dreamed about for decades, but no one had ever achieved. And then suddenly, here it is. And not only to, let's say, what might be termed sort of evolutionary or parliamentary socialists, but now a branch of a socialist movement, a revolutionary socialist movement, under the domination of a man who had no interest in any of those things. Lenin believed in the concept of a vanguard party. He believed in the concept of a dictatorship of the proletariat, whether you had a proletariat or not. What he basically believed in was the creation of a new revolutionary priesthood, which would induce change, forcible change, that it would become one great social engineering experiment. And that's really what the Bolsheviks embarked upon. They embarked upon one of the 20th century's first mass social engineering experiments. It all pretty much went wrong, but no one's going to stop once they're there. So what I'm looking at is in that book is both, of actual sort of conniving and plotting, of particular decisions that are made to invest in revolution, to invest in deliberate political instability. With the aim, when the Western capitalist aim was pretty much to reap the rewards that this new order of destroying the old order in Russia, and you're now basically going to open up one where nobody would come out and say it. You can go in and rape and pillage the place as much as you want to. You can gain the exploit because you're going to put people into power who will be obliging to you. So you see what I mean? The Bolsheviks come along, they seize power, they're very, very weak. Well, you can either spend money trying to get rid of them, and then you'll have some other come along, or you can just co-opt them. You can just buy them off. They're desperate. They want money, they want help, and some of them did. And it creates this connection between people, I think, as we were talking about Crowley, that isn't immediately apparent. But once you begin to sort of connect the dots or understand what the position of the two sides are, it really is quite logical. There is often very good reasons as to why an arch-capitalist would support a revolutionary movement in another country if they thought it would create the conditions necessary that they could profitably exploit. That's all it is. It's money.
It certainly makes the world go round, and a lot of people will put conspiracies into things, but if you just follow the money trail, that's usually where it ends up.
Yeah. Most 99 times out of 100, it will be about money.
Fascinating. Well, Richard, I got to tell you, I certainly hope we'll have an opportunity to speak again sometime, and I wouldn't
Sure.
mind going to college just to be a part of your class, man. You're a
Well,
great
thanks.
professor. This has been wonderful. I appreciate you coming on the Leak Project.
I'm very happy to be on. Any other time you want to talk, just let me know.
Oh, fantastic. And I'd recommend our listeners, if you'd like to know more about this information, there's several great books that have been put together by Richard. You've got Secret Agent 666. You've got Trust No One, Secret World of Sidney Riley. And then you've got two other books that I don't want to say the names wrong, so I'm going to let you tell our listeners.
The other one is that, if you're interested in, the thing that got me started in all of this was Boris Savinkov, Renegade on the Left, a figure who moves within the Russian Revolution that, again, you've probably never heard of because he became historically inconvenient. And the other one is Empire of the Wheel, which I co-authored with Walter Bosley. So if you're looking for a kind of true crime murder mystery set back in 1915 with some creepy but all too real doings that took place back in San Bernardino in that period, take a look at it.
Well, fantastic. And also, I'd like to recommend our listeners go to leakproject.com. If you become a contributing member at Leak Project, just go ahead and click the login section at the top, and you'll be a subscribing member. You'll have access to exclusive content, or you can just go to YouTube, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord, subscribe, become a member, have access to the latest podcasts, absolutely free. Thanks for everything. Be the change you want to see. Have a wonderful day. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I'm your host, Rex Bear, and tonight's guest is Richard B. Spence, a professor at the University of Idaho and specializing in Russian intelligence and military history. His course offers modern espionage, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust, history of secret societies, and the occult in history. Now, he is author of several books. The main focus tonight will be Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. The information Richard brings to the table is quite compelling, especially when you learn about how the occult and intelligence agencies work hand in hand. Make sure to go to leakproject.com. If you become a contributing member at Leak Project, you'll have access to exclusive content, ad-free. You can either download the shows or listen to them live streaming on the website. Also, you can go to youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord. Subscribe on YouTube, get access to the latest podcasts, absolutely free. Hope you're doing well wherever you are. Enjoy the show. And remember, be the change you want to see. This is Rex Bear. Talk to you soon.
Hello,
Hello, Richard.
this is me.
Hey, Rex Bear. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Oh, fantastic. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
I'm glad to talk to you.
Now, I'm on the website. It looks like it's the University of Idaho website. Do you have a specific website that I can promote?
No, I don't. I think that's the only one.
Okay, that's
I'm
fine.
I'm a Luddite when it comes to that, I guess.
Okay.
All
Well,
right.
now, do you have a specific book, or is it just a course about the modern espionage and the stuff that you put together with your Russian intelligence work, etc.?
Well, I've got the two main books I probably have are the one you may be the most interested in is Secret Agent 666, which deals with Aleister Crowley and British
Awesome.
intelligence and the occult.
Okay.
I also have written a book called Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley. I'm not sure if his name certainly isn't as well known as Aleister Crowley's is, but Sidney Riley was nominally, and I emphasize the nominal part, was a British intelligence operative in the early 20th century, which you usually find combined with the words a prototype or model for James Bond. He wasn't, but that's another story in and of itself. I also wrote, my first book was back in the 1990s, was a biography of another, even more obscure fellow by the name of Boris Savinkov. It's called Renegade on the Left. And there's a little tale there. Savinkov is certainly not as well known a name in the Russian Revolution as, say, Trotsky or Lenin or Kerensky. But I'd argue that he, in his own way, was every bit as important. He's one of those people that I'd say became inconvenient to the later historical narrative and therefore was largely edited out of it. Most recently, a book I co-authored with Walter Bosley is one called Empire of the Wheel. And that was kind of a departure for me because it has to do with a set of seemingly unrelated, but as it turns out, not totally unrelated murders around San Bernardino, California, back during about 1915 and 1916. And what we did there was to try to piece together who was involved and different accounts of the cases, and it leads some rather curious directions. The book I'm working on now, if I can put in a plug for that,
Absolutely.
is a book called Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. Now, that sounds familiar to some people. That's because there's a reasonably well-known book by Anthony Sutton. It was published back in the 1970s called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. So what I want to add here is that I'm not doing this book to either rip off Anthony Sutton or to, fundamentally disagree with him. One of the things his book did was to really sort of inspire me in certain ways. And I think with the materials that he had available to him, say in 1972 or 1974, he did an astounding job. There's a lot more stuff that's available. There's a lot of things that can be fleshed out. There are a few little things that could be changed or tweaked. But that's why, at least my tentative title for this book is Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, because I'm taking a kind of broader look, going all the way back to, say, 1905, the abortive revolution then, and then really sort of all the way up into the mid-20s, about a 20-year period. And that is proving quite a bit of work. And I'm sort of in the throes of trying to cobble together the various things that I've assembled for that now. But that's the main thing I'm working on at present.
When you wrote the Secret Agent 666 in regards to Aleister Crowley, I mean, this is a very infamous person that used to claim to be the most wicked man in the world, and I think that he kind of did that a lot of times just to cause ooh and ah with the masses. I've read several of his books, and actually one that really had a pretty powerful impact was the book that he wrote called Four, which is actually 4 books compiled together, and he supposedly did automatic writing with these deities. And if you've read any of that work, like the Book of the Law, the Book of Thoth, etc., I mean, just a very mystical person, and certainly liked to write in codes and riddles. I've heard that he was a British spy before, and if you even look at today's society, he has had a huge impact on Hollywood, the entertainment industry, etc. So let's get into that. What can you tell us about the infamous Aleister Crowley, the Beast?
Well, Aleister Crowley, the great beast 666, the wickedest man in the world, the arch Satanist or arch occultist of the 20th century. I think you hit upon one very important thing. A good deal of his reputation is hype. And part of that is hype of other people's creation, and part of it is hype of his own creation. But I have to add a kind of disclaimer anytime that I'm asked to talk about him. And the important disclaimer is to make it very clear up front that I am not a Crowleyite or a Thelemite. That is, I do not subscribe to his beliefs. I am not a member of any of his organizations. I don't belong to the OTO, etc. That being said, I have nothing against people who do. I'd say that of those people who are Crowley followers that I've encountered, all of them have proven to be very normal, helpful, rational people. I don't know what they do in private, but I mean, I've never had any negative encounters with them. So I sort of approach him from the standpoint of an interested party and agnostic, and that's sort of the way that I approached him. And one of the things that I'd emphasize is that there are a number of very good biographies of Aleister Crowley out there. And if you want to get the whole gist of the man, you really should read more things besides my book, because my book tends to concentrate, you get an overview of his life, but it does really concentrate on that one, I think, both overlooked and or readily dismissed and controversial area of his work for intelligence. And that's one of those things that might strike some people as seemingly fantastic, because why on earth would any intelligence agency, none less than the British, who are supposed to be fairly good at that sort of thing historically, why on earth would they employ as an agent a man of such a negative and notorious reputation? Now, that reputation, if you noticed, is still very much alive today. In fact, I'd say maybe one of the most tragic things about Aleister Crowley is that he never lived long enough to sort of finally reap the rewards of his fame. He was a man who, in economic terms, was never successful during his lifetime. He became an undischarged bankrupt in the mid-1930s and remained one up until his death in 1947, which raises a little interesting questions as to how he supported himself, but maybe we'll get to that. But today, I mean, if he still managed to own the copyrights to any of the works he'd done, he would be restored to the position of a wealthy man, which is pretty much the way he began his life. So what got me started? Let me go back there. I mean, why would I pick up this topic at all? Um, I was back at the end of the 1990s, just around 2000. I was in the throes of finishing up the book on Riley, the Trust No One book. And one of the centers of action in that book is New York during the First World War, because Riley was there as a purchasing agent for the Russian government, among other things. And one of the things I was doing, one of the things I always do with this stuff is that, when you encounter the person you're interested in, you have to pay very close attention to the people that they meet and come in contact with and do business with or sleep with or whatever. And my basic suggestion, maybe an obvious one to any researchers out there, is never ignore a lead. I mean, even if it's a seemingly casual acquaintance, the fact that people meet, you should look into it. I mean, true, 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100, that lead will go nowhere. It may just be that. It may just be a casual acquaintance of some kind. But you can't let that go without a certain degree of investigation, because one person can lead you to another. That individual that seems to be a casual acquaintance could prove to be a critical link between the figure you're interested in and someone else. So what I was interested in is that I knew that Crowley was also active in New York at the same time that Riley was. And I knew that Crowley had claimed at various points after the First World War that he had worked for the British government or British intelligence during that time. And might add that one of the reasons why he would often go out of his way to claim that was to refute the charge that he was a traitor. And the reason why people would dub him a traitor was because he did, in fact, in the period between late 1914 when he arrived and 1919 when he left during the war, one of the things he did was that he wrote anti-British propaganda for a pro-German publication. In fact, it was a magazine called The Fatherland, and I don't know what better name you could give to a pro-German publication. But he wrote for the Fatherland. He knew exactly what the Fatherland was. He knew that the editor of the Fatherland, a guy by the name of George Sylvester Viereck, was a German propaganda agent. And the stuff that Crowley wrote is, it's not accidentally anti-British. It's deliberately and scurrilously anti-British. So that, too, seems to create an apparent absurdity to say that a man who was employed in the war writing propaganda for the enemy against his own country couldn't possibly have served the interests of that country, and must have been, as he was later described, a traitor. And therefore all of his subsequent claims that what I was doing, I was really doing for the British government, and it wasn't what it was appeared, were just his attempt to try to defend his despicable reputation. Now, so what I did.
Can I jump in real quick? Do you
Sure.
feel that he was a double agent then? You're probably going there, but that's just what's going through my mind right now.
It's one of those things I wouldn't dismiss, but no, my take at looking through it is that he wasn't a double agent. He was, let's put it this way, he was a British mole inside the German propaganda and to some degree sabotage apparatus in the US. That's what his job was. The interesting question is to how he got them to accept him, knowing that he was indeed British. So, not knowing what much to think about that, and I sort of doubted he was. I figured that was just some other sort of claim that someone came up with. So I set off one of the problems that anybody has doing research in the field of historical intelligence is the sad fact that most historical records, even going back to the beginning of the 20th century or before, are off limits. That is, intelligence agencies don't see themselves generally as archiving agencies, and maybe the simplest thing to keep in mind is that these agencies are involved in collecting secret information in secretive ways. That is, they are secretive agencies, and therefore they sort of expect them to engage in the necessary secrecy of intelligence, which is the whole point of collecting information other people don't want you to have and keeping information you don't want other people to have out of their hands, to then be sort of forthcoming with their operational histories. That just doesn't really happen. But every now and then, it turns out that there's an agency of this kind that goes defunct. And one of those was an American agency that was very important in World War I, no longer really exists today in that form, which was then called the Military Intelligence Division. So what happened was when the U.S. entered the war in 1917, it really, as incredible as this may sound, did not have any real national intelligence agency, nor even internal security agency. The FBI, as it existed later, did not exist at the time, except in a very limited form. There was no CIA, there was no NSA. And so it sort of fell to the U.S. Army to develop a military intelligence apparatus. The Navy had one too, the Office of Naval Intelligence. But the MID really became the chief, it really functioned much in the way in which the FBI would function today. And internal security and the hunt against spies and saboteurs was one of the main things it was focused on. So, not too surprisingly, remember, Aleister Crowley had been in the U.S. since late 1914, and in the period up until the U.S. entry of the war, he had written pro-German propaganda, and of course that became kind of a problem when in April 1917 the United States joined the war against Germany. And as you might expect, there were people within the MID and even within the New York State Police and Attorney General's office who began to look a little askance at this Englishman not serving his country, hanging out in New York with disreputable people, and who very recently had been working for what was now the enemy. So they began looking into him. And in fact, they not only began looking into him, they even contemplated the idea of arresting him or interrogating him. So they made inquiries. And of course, one of the things that they would do, one of the things that you or I would do, is that they would inquire to the British consulate in New York, what do you know about this guy? So I sent off to Washington, to the National Archives, that holds all the surviving records of the Military Intelligence Division. And I sent off a letter with an inquiry which said, do the records of the MID contain any files pertaining to Aleister Crowley? Sure enough, it did. Not a very big file. In fact, I don't think it's only about 25 pages long. And most of it isn't terribly important, but, as often is the case, on one page, one document in that file contained this. It is a report from 1918 from the head of the MID in West Point, New York, that is up in the Hudson Valley, where Crowley had been active at that time, and this fellow had become interested in him. And so there was an inquiry that was made to the British consulate, and this is essentially what was the information they got. And I'm reading directly from the report on Aleister Crowley, English subject. And it says, he had been formally investigated by the Department of Justice on charges of being a German spy. It was determined that Aleister Crowley was an employee of the British government, but at present in this country on official business of which the British consul, New York City, has full cognizance. It was found that the British government was fully aware of the fact that Crowley was connected with the German propaganda and had received money for writing anti-British articles. Now, the reason why that was important is that basically confirms what Crowley later claimed. So when later on he was saying that, yes, I wrote this stuff, but it was all, it was basically designed to win the confidence of the Germans so that I could take advantage of that confidence, and I was really a loyal Englishman doing his bit in his own peculiar way. Well, in that case, he was telling the truth. So that got me interested, and I used that file to write a short article, which, the title of that was also Secret Agent 666. And that article was published in a small journal, I think that the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, which if no one has ever heard of, that's because, like most academic journals, no one has ever heard of them. But one of the things that happened is that thanks to the internet, and also, of course, the sort of global interest that the name Aleister Crowley creates, that article was spread around from one place to another, which, by the way, I didn't mind because, just to let your listeners know, professors don't get paid for writing academic articles. We generally don't get paid for writing academic books either. But
okay.
So, no, you don't get paid. Sometimes
Well, that sucks.
they actually expect you to pay. Well, that's the way that's the research we're supposed to do. That's how we keep our jobs.
Gotcha. Okay.
But, one of the things that's always kind of despairing about that in a way, I actually had someone, another historian, who said, well, if you really want to sort of hide historical information, what you do is you publish it in an academic journal, which is pretty much the equivalent of digging a hole, throwing it in, and burying it. And that's a bit of an exaggeration. But the point is, not many people access those, and not many people read them. And this is, in fact, one of my whole complaints about the way in which a lot of historical research, the way historians sort of relate to the outside world is that we're all too often sort of writing for each other instead, I think, of trying to make the information that we have more broadly available. So that sort of, that article achieved a life of its own, and I started getting feedback. I started getting emails and even actual letters from people saying, well, this is interesting. Maybe you should look more into this. Maybe you should look more into that. And I began getting several people, actually, from different angles. Some of them sort of fans of Crowley, some of them not, saying, you really ought to expand that. You really ought to maybe see if you could make a book out of it. Maybe there's a bigger story there. And at first, I really wasn't certain. Thought I would give it a try. In fact, one of the reasons I was a little